On my birthday, my son handed me a bottle of whiskey wrapped in silk paper. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just don't choke on it, Dad," he said lightly, as if it were a harmless joke. I forced a smile, but something in his tone lingered, sharp and unsettling. Like a splinter I couldn't quite pull out. Hours later, when the laughter from the patio had faded and the house grew quiet, my phone buzzed with a message that froze my blood. It was from my grandson, Ethan. "Grandpa, don't drink the whiskey Dad gave you." He told me the truth. The words seemed to tilt the entire room. My heart thudded as if it wanted to climb out of my chest. I stared at the bottle sitting on the kitchen counter, its amber liquid glowing under the soft Ohio evening light, and for the first time in 75 years I felt the air tighten around me like a noose. 2 days later, I invited my son back, poured him that same whiskey into 2 crystal glasses, and slid one across the table. What happened next made my world collapse and rebuild itself in a single moment. But before that confrontation, before the truth fully broke open, there was the weight of memory and silence pressing on me like an unshakable storm cloud. That afternoon had been meant for celebration. July 4th, 2:30 in the afternoon. The patio dressed in Martha's favorite colors, red, white, and blue. I had been out there for almost an hour, fussing with the arrangement of chairs, aligning them exactly as she would have wanted. Her china sat neatly on the table, plates with tiny blue flowers she had saved for special days. The kind of detail that would have made her smile and say, "You never miss the little things." I had lit the grill, coaxed the flames to life after 3 stubborn tries, and listened to the hiss of propane turning into fire. Even after 40 years as an engineer, I still found comfort in the simple victory of machines obeying my hands. And yet no one had called. Not even a quick "Happy birthday, Dad," from Melvin. The silence of my phone had already cut deeper than I wanted to admit. My fingers had trembled as I placed old photographs along the patio table. My son at 12, gap-toothed, proud after building his first treehouse with me. A younger me with grease-stained hands holding him up on my shoulders after a little league win. Memories that once anchored me now felt like weights dragging me under. 3 months earlier, he had cornered me in the kitchen during Easter dinner. I remembered the way his voice had tightened when he spoke about my will, about my arrangements. As though my continued existence was merely a logistical inconvenience. I remembered how he had looked around the house, his jaw set, his eyes cold, as if calculating square footage instead of seeing the walls that held his childhood. That expression had haunted me since. By 3:20, I was straightening the blue button-down shirt Martha had bought me for Father's Day 2 years before. I could almost smell her perfume still clinging to the fabric, though I knew it was just memory playing tricks. I told myself this birthday would be different, a chance for reconciliation. Then I heard the car door slam out front, earlier than expected. My pulse quickened. It was my daughter Ella who appeared first through the gate, carrying a gift bag and wearing the same worried expression she'd worn ever since her divorce. Relief flooded me. It wasn't Melvin yet. She hugged me tightly, as if making sure I was still solid, still here. We sat together at the patio table, her voice dropping low as she twisted the ring on her finger. "Dad, I need to tell you something about Melvin," she whispered. Each word from her lips was another stone added to the weight in my chest. She spoke of odd questions, of him asking how long people usually live after retirement, of his sudden interest in my new blood pressure medication. She told me she had overheard him talking about natural causes on the phone, words that no child should use when speaking about their father. I had wanted to brush it off, to defend him, to say stress makes people say things they don't mean. But then she told me about their money troubles, the mortgage falling behind, medical bills piling up, debts that seemed to multiply faster than they could pay. And suddenly the shadows I'd ignored began to take shape. At 4:10, multiple car doors slammed in unison. My grandson's voice rang out, bright and unburdened. "Grandpa, we're here." Ethan bounded through the gate with the joy of a boy who still saw me as a hero. His hug was fierce, his laughter genuine. Behind him came Wendy with casserole dishes, her warmth as steady as always. And then Melvin stepped forward, carrying an elegantly wrapped bottle of whiskey, His smile calculated, his eyes cold. "This is for you, Dad," he said, placing the bottle in my hands. I could see the faint tremor of anticipation in his fingers, though his face remained smooth. "The good stuff, 25 years aged. Only the best for you." The bottle was heavy in my palms, its price tag written all over its weight and wrapping. I started to thank him, but before the words could leave my mouth, he leaned close, his voice barely audible. "Don't choke on it." I froze. My smile stayed plastered on, but inside something shattered. Ella's eyes met mine across the table, her face pale though she hadn't heard the words. The others laughed, served food, filled their plates. Only I sat still, the whiskey bottle gleaming in the center like a monument to betrayal. My son's whisper echoed in my skull, relentless, inescapable. Later that night, after the family had gone, I sat in the kitchen, staring at the unopened bottle, when my phone buzzed. Ethan's message lit up the screen. "Grandpa, don't drink the whiskey Dad gave you. I saw him put something in it. Please don't." The kitchen seemed to tilt sideways. My grandson, 14, innocent, had carried the secret, terrified, until he finally let it spill into my trembling hands. I whispered to the empty room, "My son wants me dead." The words tasted bitter, unreal, but the bottle sitting under the light told me otherwise. And the night closed in around me, heavy with the knowledge that nothing in my family would ever be the same again. The night after Ethan's warning, I found myself sitting in the quiet of my old house, staring at the bottle of whiskey that had once seemed like a generous gesture. Now it looked more like a weapon dressed in elegance, its golden liquid carrying the weight of a betrayal I was only beginning to understand. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, Martha's face appeared, the way she used to look at me when life tested us. She'd tell me to stay steady, to face the storm the way we always had. But this storm wasn't like any we had weathered before. This one had come from my own blood. Morning light spilled across the wooden floors I had refinished decades earlier, each plank worn smooth by years of footsteps, laughter, and grief. I walked through the house, touching familiar places like they could ground me. The banister still bore a faint dent from when Melvin, no more than 8 years old then, slid down it too fast and slammed into the wall. He had cried in my arms that day, his tears soaking through my work shirt, and I had promised him he was safe. How could that same boy have grown into a man who saw me as an obstacle instead of a father? I pulled an old ledger from the desk in the den, the same one where I had once balanced overtime paychecks against mortgage bills, tuition fees, and medical expenses. My engineer's handwriting filled its pages, numbers neat and exact, proof of a life spent holding everything together. Tuition for the University of Washington, nearly $100,000 over 4 years, each check written without hesitation. The down payment on his first house in Shoreline, $28,000 wired from my savings, the money I had meant to keep for retirement. And the countless smaller sums, $3,000 for a car repair, $5,000 when he'd lost his job, $12,000 when his marriage had hit the rocks. Each withdrawal had been justified with the same thought. He's my son, and a father doesn't measure love in dollars. As I turned those pages, I felt my chest tighten, not with regret but with a kind of slow, dawning clarity. Every sacrifice had been a brick laid in what I thought was the foundation of family. Now I realized it might have only built a path he believed led directly to my grave. I walked outside, into the small backyard where Martha had once planted rows of tulips. The garden had grown wild in the years since she passed, but I still saw her there, kneeling in the dirt with her gloves on, sweat on her brow and a smile on her lips. She loved this house as fiercely as I did. It wasn't just a building. It was memory, promise, and sanctuary. The thought of Melvin circling it like prey made my stomach turn. By the time evening came, I couldn't sit still. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photo albums stacked nearby. One photo caught my eye, a younger Melvin at his high school graduation, cap slightly askew, pride written all over his face. I remembered working a double shift the night before just so I could afford the suit he wore that day. I had shown up tired, my hands still raw from climbing poles in the cold, but I wouldn't have missed it for anything. That smile, that moment, had felt like my reward for every sacrifice. But the man who had given me that smile was gone, replaced by someone colder, harder, someone who whispered threats behind a ribboned gift. The truth started piecing itself together. His recent questions about my health, the way he'd looked at the house during Easter, Jenna's slip about keeping it in the family, and now Ethan's trembling warning. My mind raced through every conversation, every glance I had overlooked. It all formed a picture I didn't want to see but could no longer deny. He wasn't just impatient. He was planning. The following morning, I woke before dawn and sat at the table with a pen in hand. I began writing everything I could remember. The strange comments, the debts Ella mentioned, the way Melvin had studied me as if waiting for a sign of weakness. I wrote down Ethan's words exactly as he had sent them. His small act of courage that might have saved my life. Each line I wrote made the betrayal more solid, but it also sharpened my focus. I had been an engineer my whole life. I solved problems with precision, and this was no different. When Ella stopped by later that week with groceries, she noticed the strain on my face. She lingered longer than usual, asking questions with that same careful tone she used on her students. I didn't tell her everything. I couldn't burden her with the full truth yet, but I saw the worry in her eyes. She knew enough to be afraid. As she left, she squeezed my hand and said softly, "Just be careful, Dad." That night, I found myself standing in the garage, looking at the old workbench where I had once taught Melvin how to use a hammer. The tools were still lined up in neat order, their handles worn smooth from decades of use. It struck me then that the same discipline I had applied to every project, every blueprint, could be applied here. Betrayal was just another structure to be dismantled piece by piece. The whiskey bottle still sat on the counter, its glass catching the light like it was mocking me. I approached it slowly, almost reverently, as though it could explode at any moment. I lifted it, feeling its weight, and whispered to myself, "This is evidence, not just of poison, but of everything that had gone wrong between father and son." I placed it carefully into a heavy-duty zip bag and sealed it tight. The next morning, as the city stretched awake, I slid into my old Ford and drove across the West Seattle Bridge, the skyline gray with early fog. I passed the ballpark, the cranes along the waterfront, all the familiar landmarks of a city I had helped keep lit for 40 years. But this drive was different. I wasn't heading to a job site. I was heading to find the truth. The independent toxicology lab sat near the freight yards, its building unremarkable, tucked between warehouses and the faint clang of metal on metal. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and old paper. I carried the whiskey in like it was dynamite, setting it gently on the counter. My hands trembled only once as I filled out the chain of custody forms, my signature neat but heavy. When I left the lab, I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at the envelope they had promised would hold the results. The noise of the city blurred around me, distant and meaningless. I thought about how far this had come, from a boy who once held my hand at a little league game to a man who might be plotting my death. The weight of it pressed against my chest until I could hardly breathe. But beneath that pressure, there was something else, something steady, a resolve forming like steel under heat. I drove home slowly, the envelope of results still hours away. My house awaited me, quiet, its walls full of ghosts. I walked inside and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Melvin once spread his homework, where Martha once set down plates of dinner, where Ethan now sometimes drew pictures while we talked about baseball. This table had seen all of it: love, loss, sacrifice, betrayal, and it would soon bear witness to whatever came next. The lab called just after noon, a neutral voice leaving a message that the report was ready for pickup. I listened twice, the words crisp and ordinary, as if they weren't about to rip open the floor beneath my feet. I drove back across the West Seattle Bridge with both hands clamped at 10 and 2, the skyline hazed by low clouds that pressed the city closer to the water. A freight train moaned down near the port. The building sat where I'd left it. Concrete box, smoked windows, a small blue sign that could have been for a dentist. Inside, the air smelled like isopropyl and printer toner. A woman with kind eyes took my claim number, and disappeared through a door marked, "Authorized personnel only." I felt my heartbeat inside my teeth. When she returned, she carried a manila envelope and a measured expression that never quite softened. We stepped into a small consultation room with a table and 2 chairs. Nothing on the walls except an emergency exit diagram. She removed a stapled packet, slid it toward me, and pointed to 2 lines highlighted in yellow. The shapes meant nothing at first, peaks and valleys on a graph, acronyms in tidy columns. Then my brain translated. Benzodiazepine derivative detected. Concentration detailed to the decimal, a range of consequences spelled out in a paragraph so calm that it made the floor tilt. Sedation, respiratory depression, confusion, risk of fatal events with repeated ingestion, especially in seniors with cardiac history. The word fatal sat on the page like a small black stone I couldn't swallow. I told myself to breathe. 40 years of storms on power lines, of whiteouts and gusts that could knock a man from a pole, had taught me the discipline of staying steady. Your hands shake later. You move clean now. I read the chain of custody line 3 times, then the technician's name, then the sample ID, all the small reliabilities that turn a suspicion into proof. She asked if I had questions. I said not yet. I signed for the packet, slid it into the envelope, and thanked her with a voice that surprised me by sounding normal. In the truck, I laid the envelope on the passenger seat like a passenger I needed to buckle in. The wipers squeaked once across a windshield that didn't need them. I stared through the glass at the roadway, big rigs blurring past on their way to somewhere impersonal, and thought about the hand that had poured death into a bottle and tied it up with silk paper. My son's hand. The boy who used to fit in the crook of my arm during Saturday Mariners games on TV, who once fell asleep with his head on my chest while I explained why the bridge we drove over didn't fall down. Don't think about that now, I told myself. Catalog. Build the structure step by step. At home, I set the envelope on the kitchen table and stood a long moment to feel the grain of the wood under my fingers. Martha had rubbed linseed oil into the surface every spring. It held years of dinners and homework and birthday candles. The chair creaked as I sat, flipped open the packet, and read every line without blinking. The details were clinical, mercifully so. The report didn't know about the photo of a gap-toothed boy at a treehouse. It only knew chemistry and concentration and conclusions. Maybe that was a gift. You can't argue with molecules. I took out my yellow legal pad and wrote the name of the compound in block letters, then the concentration. Underneath, I wrote what the technician had said in phrases I could hear again if I needed to: repeated ingestion, cumulative effect, significant risk, misinterpreted as age-related decline. The pen left a groove in the paper where I pressed too hard on the word misinterpreted. It was a neat design. I had to give him that. A slow disaster dressed up as time. You don't need a syringe when patience will do the job. The phone vibrated on the table. For one instant, I thought it would be Melvin, but the name on the screen made my chest go tight in a different way. Ethan. My finger hovered, the memory of his message flashing back like a lightning strike in a dark room. I answered and listened to his breath before he spoke. He didn't launch into a story. He asked if I was okay. I told him yes, and meant it in the way you mean a thing while standing on a cliff with your heels at the edge. He said he'd been scared since the party, scared of his dad's changeable moods, of a secret too heavy for 14-year-old shoulders. He told me he had seen the small bottle, not just a suspicion, but a glass dropper cupped in his father's hand behind the garage before they left for my house. He had asked what it was, and his father had snapped, "It's nothing, vitamins," then ruffled his hair too hard. Ethan's voice shook when he said the word vitamins like it tasted wrong. I told him he had done the brave thing, that sometimes courage is quiet, done with thumbs on a screen and no witnesses. I asked him gently to delete the thread, to keep himself safe, to talk to his mother if he needed to, and to call me anytime, day or night. He went quiet, then said he didn't know who to trust, not even himself, because love twists the evidence when it's your dad. I told him I understood, that love can make a courtroom out of your chest. When we hung up, I laid the phone on the table and placed my palm over it, as if I could steady the boy on the other end by touch alone. I opened the binder Martha had labeled Estate and Powers with her tidy hand. Plastic sleeves whispered as I turned pages. Old healthcare directives, durable powers of attorney, beneficiary designations we'd updated the year before she got sick. Her paper order calmed my breath. I slid the lab packet into a sleeve near the front and wrote chemical evidence in black marker on the tab. Then I pulled a smaller binder from the cabinet, the one I'd started after Easter, when Melvin first asked about my arrangements. It had been half notes and half denial then. Now I made it real. I listed dates, what was said, what I saw. April 23rd. Will conversation, his tone hard when I declined to change distribution. May 9th. Follow-up texts asking about my medications and whether I ever felt dizzy. July 4th. The whisper at my ear, just don't choke on it. Ethan's warning. The bottle sealed in a zip bag. The lab result. I did not editorialize. I didn't need to. When I paused to flex the cramp out of my fingers, the house settled around me, the old furnace making a familiar tick. I could feel Martha beside me in that ordinary sound, telling me to keep going the way she once did when I came home wet and frozen from a night call and wanted to collapse on the couch. Hot shower. Then finish the report. I took the shower. I made coffee. I sat back down, and the next step presented itself as plainly as a switch you flip at dusk. Find the rest of the pattern. I didn't have access to Melvin's accounts, but there are public records if you know where to look. King County's recorder had a user portal I'd used once to download the original deed. I searched his address. There it was, Hellick recorded last fall with a rate that made me wince, another amendment in April. A small claims judgment from a contractor in Ballard. A notice of delinquent dues from a homeowners association in a tidy suburb. I printed each one and slid them into the binder until the weight of the plastic felt like something I could bench press. My phone buzzed again, this time with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but instinct nudged. Wendy's voice came glancing off the line like a bird landing on a branch too light for it. She sounded careful. She said she'd gotten a new number for deals on Facebook Marketplace, which I understood as a way to call me without it showing on a family plan. She didn't ask how I was. She told me not to drink the gift. Her words crowded and hushed, as if the walls were listening. I said I was fine, and that I understood more than I had before. She started to cry then, quietly, the tears of a person who has been holding too much for too long. She said things had gotten away from them, that she couldn't control the panic that flew around their house at night when the mail arrived with new warnings. That Melvin had begun to talk in loops, saying phrases like, natural timeline, and no one questions the inevitable. She said she loved her son, and she didn't know how to love him and stop him at the same time. I listened. I told her there was a way to protect Ethan without blowing up the world in a single day. I said that I would handle the legal parts, and that she should keep herself and her boy safe. When we hung up, I thought of how a person can be complicit in something terrible by drowning in it, then find a sliver of conscience to cling to when the tide changes. The call did not absolve anything, but it mapped the edges. A crack had opened in their house. Light gets in through cracks. After lunch, I walked into the den and pulled down the old banker's box labeled Evan in blue painter's tape from years ago, and I corrected it in my mind, Melvin, and set it at my feet. It seemed smaller than it once had, maybe because I had carried heavier things today. I laid the contents on the rug. The copies of tuition checks, the down payment transfer, the emails that began with "Dad, I hate to ask" and ended with "I promise I'll make this right." I didn't argue with those emails when they arrived years ago. I believed them. Maybe belief had made me easy to rob. Maybe it was the only way to keep loving him then. Either way, it was part of the record now. I placed each piece into the new binder chronological. A story in receipts, an autobiography written in wire transfers, and the way a father signs his name. By late afternoon, the light in the kitchen turned the edges of things to silver. I stood and stretched, feeling every year in my back like a stack of coins. I made a simple dinner and ate it without tasting it, then washed the plate and set it in the rack. Routine was ballast. When the phone rang again, I recognized the name from a card tucked into Martha's binder. Amira Patel, the estate attorney we'd used to tidy our wills the year before the cancer. Her voice was the kind you trust before it says anything of value, the steadiness you get from people who have sat in too many conference rooms while families tore each other apart. I told her I needed an urgent appointment. She asked if I could explain in 3 sentences, and I found the sentences without searching. She did not gasp or prick the call with exclamation points. She said she had time in the morning if I could bring documentation. I looked at the binder and the lab packet and felt, for the first time in 2 days, the invisible lift that comes when the weight on your chest becomes a case you can carry. That night, sleep kept its distance, but it wasn't a frantic kind. I lay in bed listening to the faraway ferry horn and the drip of rain from the gutter, thinking not about poison but about structure. How a bridge stands because every piece knows the force it must take. How a house endures not because it never sways, but because it's framed to flex without breaking. I had built a life that way. I realized overtime and savings and repairs done right, every nail at the angle Martha preferred. Somewhere along the line, I had mistaken providing with preventing. You can keep the lights on for someone and still not see them clearly. The new plan wasn't about vengeance. It was about rerouting current so it didn't arc and burn the one person in that house who hadn't chosen any of this. In the morning, the sky cracked to a fragile blue. I made coffee and packed the binder, the lab report, the notes on public records into a canvas bag that used to carry my tools. I hesitated, then tucked a photo of Ethan into the pocket. Him mid-laugh at a Rainiers game last summer, a smear of mustard on his cheek, his eyes bright without effort. I wrote myself 4 lines on an index card and slipped it into my wallet. Protect the boy. Don't escalate rage. Let the paper do the talking. Breathe. The card felt small, but it held a shape I could follow when the room got loud. Before I left, I stepped into the garage and opened the drawer where we kept the tape. On a whim, I pulled out a strip of blue painter's tape and tore it in half. I stuck one piece to the lip of the decanter still sealed in its bag, even though it was no longer part of the plan, and the other to the spine of the binder. A quiet label only I could read. Lights on. It was a silly ritual, but it made my hands stop shaking. The freeway into downtown stitched along the water, the ferries moving across Elliott Bay like patient creatures that know the trick of balance. I parked, rode the elevator up to Amira's floor, and stepped into a lobby where the receptionist smiled without asking for reasons. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon polish. I set the binder on the table and placed the lab packet on top. The stack looked modest and unstoppable, the way certain storms move, beautiful from a distance, merciless up close. When Amira walked in, she shook my hand, met my eye, and sat without fuss. "Tell me what we need to fix," she said. I took a breath. The words came out steady, carrying all the anchors I'd set in the last 24 hours. I didn't tell her about the ache in my chest when I looked at old photographs or the way my hand wanted to reach for my son's shoulder even now. I told her about molecules and paper and a boy's text that changed the weather in our family. I told her I wasn't here to punish. I was here to reroute, to build the kind of structure that doesn't fail when a storm throws its whole weight against the frame. She nodded once, already flipping to a fresh legal pad, her pen poised. The plan unfurled between us like blueprints, clean lines where grief had been. Somewhere in that quiet, I felt Martha's palm on my shoulder, the way it used to land when a job was hard and needed finishing. We were going to finish it. Amira's office sat in a wedge of glass above Pike Place, the kind of view that makes people talk softer. I set the canvas tool bag on the table and took out the binder, the lab packet, and the printouts with the ugly numbers. She didn't rush me. She read with a lawyer's economy, turning pages as if they might cut her if she wasn't careful. When she reached the toxicology report, she drew a small breath that could have been sympathy or strategy. It didn't matter which. I was here for architecture, not condolences. "We're going to separate power from proximity," she said finally, tapping a clean legal pad. "You keep living your life. Your assets stop being reachable by the person who wants them to fail you." Then she translated the thought into tools. An irrevocable trust, Ethan as sole beneficiary, locked against anyone else's hands. A corporate trustee with no dinner table loyalties. Distributions tied to schooling and health, not whims. A spendthrift clause that made bad decisions bounce off like hail. I nodded while my throat quietly burned. She asked about my house, The Ballard Craftsman that still smells faintly of linseed oil if you open the cutlery drawer. "We can't put the roof over your head beyond your reach," she said. "But we can set it to move when you do. Transfer on death deed, recorded properly, to slide the house to Ethan's trust without pausing in probate where predators hunt. Beneficiary designations on every account refreshed so they bridge past anyone who might try to stand in the way. Revocation and reissue of every power of attorney. My signatures lifted away from anyone who thought familiarity meant authority." She read back my answers the way Foreman read back measurements. I confirmed each one. We spoke quietly about things most people avoid saying aloud. What if my heart quit one night in the chair where Martha used to fall asleep reading seed catalogs? What if I slipped on the back steps when the rain turned the moss slick? What if someone insisted on a different story surrounding my last day? Amira wrote while I spoke. "The paperwork is your voice when someone tries to talk over you," she said, and slid a card across the table. The name of a detective in the SPD Elder Abuse Unit printed in plain font. "For now this stays in your wallet. If it needs to leave, it leaves fast." Witnesses arrived from the hall with neutral faces. I initialed where she pointed, signed where she marked an X, let a notary stamp clack like a gavel. When she tucked the executed trust into a stiff folder, the sound calmed something inside me. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like ballast. I asked her to repeat the part about Ethan's protection. She did, slower this time. "No access by his parents," she said. "No loans against it. No borrowing today against tomorrow. Only health, education, and a start when he's old enough to treat a start like a sacred thing." I exhaled in a way that didn't sound like me. "Good," I said. "That's the job." On the way out, I carried the folder like a newborn, careful in my steps as if a curb could jar it loose. I didn't go home yet. At the locksmith on Market Street, a man with forearms like fence posts replaced the old brass with a Schlage deadbolt that listens to no one but the codes I feed it. I bought 2 spare cylinders, not because I needed them, but because contingency feels like oxygen now. At the hardware store I used to haunt for copper fittings, I bought a small fireproof safe and a length of lag bolts. In the garage, I anchored the safe under the workbench where the old planer lives. The drill whined, the bolts bit, the bench vibrated the way it did when I taught Melvin to drive nails without bending them. The memory soured halfway through. I set the SPD card inside the safe next to the trust, the lab report, the binder of receipts that now reads like a family history without adjectives. If someone turned this house inside out, they'd still miss what matters. I should have eaten. Instead, I drove to a Capitol Hill shop where they speak about scotch the way fishermen talk about rivers. A young man with a neat beard produced a bottle identical to the one Melvin had gifted with such ceremony. He set it on the counter like something holy. "Special occasion?" he asked. "Correction," I said before I could stop myself. He blinked, polite enough not to ask. "Gift wrap?" No, the bottle rode home belted into the passenger seat where my folder had sat that morning. Back in my kitchen, I pulled on nitrile gloves from a box under the sink and stood the original decanter under the task light. The amber looked beautiful as poison often does. I paused and stared longer than made sense. Then I poured the contents into the sink and watched a small fortune swirl away like it never mattered. Hot water, soap, rinse, rinse again. The glass dried on a rack while I checked the meniscus line in the photo I'd taken on July 4th. I filled the decanter from the new bottle until the line matched the photograph exactly under warm light, under cool light, under no light. I stepped to the living room and set the decanter on the coffee table. It caught the lamp like a tame fire. The clean smell of citrus wax lingered in the room because I had polished the wood earlier for no reason other than control. I ate a hamburger at Dick's in the truck with the windows cracked and the wrapper crinkling like old maps. A pen and a small index card sat on the steering wheel. I wrote 4 lines and said them aloud like a lineman's checklist. Protect the boy. Let paper speak. No rage. Breathe. I slid the card into my wallet behind my driver's license where it wouldn't glare at me, but would be there when my voice wanted to break. A pack of teenagers laughed 3 cars over. A sound bright enough to crack something open. I let it. Back home, I walked the house like a man checking voltage. Wise cams blinked to life. The kitchen pointed at the counter. The living room pointed at the coffee table and door, the porch watching the steps where Boots have delivered every version of news. I do not like being watched in my own house, but I like less the idea that a story could be written here without paper to contradict it. I moved through the rooms with Martha's whisper keeping pace. "Back to the panel, Robert," she used to say when I'd stop halfway through a job and stew. "Flip the breaker. Test your line. It's the same every time, simple steps done well." I set the last camera and flipped the breaker on my temper to the off position. The quiet held. Jenna texted from a number I didn't recognize, and my first thought wasn't caution but pity. "He's not sleeping," she wrote. "He went back to the garage twice tonight. He says he hears a clock." The word stung. I could see the clock on my mantle in my mind, the one that used to chide me into brushing my teeth before bed and now just marks time with dignity. I typed back that she and Ethan should stay away until Sunday night and that I would handle the rest. She replied with a single word that means everything when it's honest. "Thank you." I didn't answer because I didn't know whether thanks belonged to me or to the boy who should be thinking about school, not sedatives and inheritances. I called Ella. I didn't tell her details that would make sleep impossible. I told her I was changing some paperwork, that she should hear it from me and not from Melvin. She didn't ask for more, which is love at this age, a person who trusts that your silence is a measured one. "Do you need me Monday?" she asked. "If things go sideways." "They won't." I lied, then softened it. "But I'll call." She let out the breath she'd been holding since Easter and said goodnight using the voice she used when she was little and the power went out. A voice that believes in candles and blankets and waiting it out together. After we hung up, I stood with the receiver in my hand longer than made sense, the way people used to linger at payphones because ending the call made the world louder. The decanter looked like a prop when I returned to the living room, and I hated that, hated turning something as old and human as whiskey into theater. But this was part of the architecture, too. Let the man drink what he meant for me. Let his nerves scream at his own reflection. Then let the paper speak. I set 2 heavy-bottomed glasses beside the bottle and added coasters from a Mariners giveaway. A private joke from Martha because she always teased me about using coasters on furniture I'd built to survive earthquakes. On the shelf below the coffee table, I tucked the binder with its ugly truth. On top of it I placed Amira's business card and, beside that, the SPD detective's card. Not because I intended to dial it in front of him, but because I wanted him to see the future in 2 possible fonts. The next morning I woke before the gulls started their rude work. I made coffee and sat with the Seattle Times, pretending to read headlines about traffic and boats as if my house weren't a loading dock for truth. Instead of words, I heard measurements. Glassware at 2 o'clock from the couch corner. Evidence at 4 o'clock under the table. Door at 12 with sight lines to the street. Breaker off on my anger. I cleaned my glasses with the corner of my shirt the way Martha used to and laughed once without humor at the fact that grief can make a man tidy. Amira called to tell me the e-recordings had posted. "The trust is live," she said. "Consider it a separate electrical circuit. If one line shorts, the other stays lit." I pictured a panel with clean labels and the tangle of old wiring I'd been meaning to fix for 5 years. "Thank you," I said. "If you feel unsafe at any time, call the detective," she added. "Or call me. I don't wear a badge, but I know where the courthouse doors unlock." My throat made an unsteady sound. "I don't want a war," I said, meaning it. "I want a life." "Then don't fight one," she replied. "Just walk where the law makes a path." After we hung up, I put her card on the safe again as if double weight could keep fear from sliding it around. I spent the afternoon on small tasks that pretended to be ordinary. I sharpened the chisels I haven't used since the porch project. I fixed the squeak in the back gate with a spritz of silicone and a muttered apology to the neighbors for weeks of noise I'd stopped hearing. I wrote a letter to Ethan on line paper with my blocky script, the kind teachers like for handwriting. I told him that being a man is not the art of never being afraid. It's the discipline of letting fear change your posture, not your values. I told him the house would take care of him someday. But until then, he should learn to take care of houses, because anything you steward tends to stand with you when wind hits. I folded the letter and slid it into the safe. When the shadows shifted long across the living room and the decanter burned like late sun, I dialed my son. The call connected on the third ring. His voice came bright, rehearsed. "Hey, Dad." I could hear traffic through his window and the caffeinated courtesy he gives clients. "How are you?" "I've been thinking," I said. And the tone that fell out of my mouth belonged to the man he listened to when he was 7 and wanted to put a nail in a live outlet. "About your concerns in April. About my will." The silence on the other end wasn't silence. It was the sound of his heart rate picking up. "Yeah," he said, too casual. "I may have been stubborn. I lied just enough to serve the truth. Maybe it's time to revisit some choices." He cleared his throat. I appreciate your openness. When do you want to talk?" "Sunday," I said. 7 o'clock. Just us." The careful relief he exhaled could have tipped a sailboat. "Do you want me to bring anything?" "Your time," I said. "And your attention." We said goodbye like we do when everything is simple. After, I stood in the living room and watched my hand shake for the first time in 2 days. I let it. Then I took the index card from my wallet and read the 4 lines aloud until my breathing slowed to a pace that wouldn't betray me. I poured an inch of the clean whiskey and held it up to the lamp. Martha's picture on the mantel caught the same light, and for a foolish second I heard her say, "Steady, Robert." I set the glass down untouched. Sunday would do the drinking. That night, sleep hovered then refused me, and I let it sit on the edge of the bed like a cat that thinks it owns the place. I lay in the dark and followed the plan through again from doorbell to exit. The details lined up like bolts in a crossarm. Pour. Toast. Don't sip. Reveal. Paper. Choice. If he cries, don't comfort. If he rages, don't rise. If he tries to leave before seeing the last page, name the detective. A dozen contingencies stacked, each one a rung on a ladder I could climb out on if the conversation went bad. I thought of the way storms look from a bucket at the top of a pole, close, intimate, louder than logic. You do not reason with wind. You lean and keep your belt clipped. I slept an hour toward dawn and woke with the certainty that I had done all I could without stepping into violence. On Sunday I cooked a decent dinner I had no appetite for, because the house needed the smell. I set 2 plates at the kitchen table and then put one away with a small laugh at my own superstition. I wiped the coffee table again, though it didn't need it. I straightened the coasters until they were an engineer's joke, measured by eye. I stood at the window and watched the last ferry make a white stitch across the bay. When the sun finally slid behind the Olympics, the room turned the exact color of caution tape in a thunderhead, and it calmed me. Weather is honest. Tells you what it is before it arrives. At 6:45, I washed my hands and dried them thoroughly because wet palms make a man look weak. At 6:50, I checked the camera feeds, then turned my phone face down so his reflection wouldn't catch in it and distract either of us. At 6:55, I opened the safe and looked once at the folder with Ethan's name on it, the future already written in hard ink. I closed the safe gently. At 6:58, I put on the blue shirt Martha always teased me about for its stubborn collar and smoothed it down while my heart beat like a signal lamp. At 7 o'clock on the dot, my phone lit with a text. "Parking now," Melvin wrote. "Be there in 2. I stared at the words that started everything and ended something at the same time. I walked to the door. The house felt like it does in the second before the power comes back after an outage, that breathless pause where circuits lean toward light. The porch light caught the rain in thin, glittering lines as I opened the door before the bell could ring. Melvin stood framed by the drizzle, hair damp, jacket zipped halfway like a man halfway decided on his choices. He glanced past me, not at my face but into the living room where the coffee table waited the way a stage waits for actors. His eyes found the decanter in the center, and something eased in his shoulders. If it was relief, it was the wrong kind. He stepped in with careful friendliness, the kind he uses with people he needs things from. We didn't shake hands. I gestured toward the couch. The house felt like a power station after an outage. Everything alive and humming, circuits quietly testing themselves. I noticed the way his gaze gravitated again to the amber in the glass, how his tongue touched his teeth as if tasting a result he'd already predicted. The cameras blinked once, the tiny LEDs soft as fireflies. I turned off all chimes. No sound now except the rain and his breath and mine. I poured 2 measured ounces. The old habit of leveling by I came back like muscle memory. Keep the meniscus exact, just where it should be. I set 1 glass before him, kept the other in my hand. The scent of peat and orange peel lifted between us. It could have been any Sunday night in a house where peace still lived. It was not. We raised our glasses. I let him choose the words. He chose the simplest, the one that's hardest to swallow when it's a lie. To family. His voice held. He drank. Not a dainty sip, not a careful taste. A swallow that spoke of confidence. He expected me to drink too. I didn't. I set my glass down untouched and watched the first fracture open in his face. There are looks of father catalogs without knowing. The one your son wore when he learned to ride a bike. The one he wore when he lied about a dent in a fender. The one that appears when he realizes the room has shifted without him. It arrived now, quick and almost invisible. A flicker in the eyes and a small flare of nostrils. He recovered quickly. He always has. I slid the stapled packet across the table. The paper made a soft sound on the wood. The sound I'd been hearing in my head for 2 days. Chemistry, not suspicion. Numbers, not fear. He glanced down as if it were a restaurant check and lifted the top page with 2 fingers. I didn't speak. I let the paragraphs do what paragraphs do when they are built from molecules and proof. His eyes moved in little jumps. His throat worked. The tip of his tongue touched his lip the way it did when he studied math as a teenager and didn't want help. He set the report down too fast and reached for his glass again. The amber shook inside it. He didn't drink this time. His voice came out quieter than the rain. What is this? It wasn't a question. He knew. He knew because the hand that had done it still remembered the weight of a dropper, and because the boy he'd raised was old enough to text his grandfather in the middle of a summer night and tell the truth. I told him the compound name in plain syllables and pointed to the concentration line. I kept my tone even. If you've stood in a bucket at the top of a pole while wind tries to rip the world apart, you learn how to pitch your voice so it doesn't feed the storm. I explained cumulative effect. I explained misinterpretation as natural decline. I watched him realize that what he had planned to be an invisible slope now had a bright white guardrail labeled in ink. He put the glass down carefully now, as if the table were thin ice. His hand hovered near his throat like a man who was suddenly aware of his breathing. Then he laughed, short and ugly. He said the words people reach for when the house fire is already in the walls. This is ridiculous. Accusations. Said. I nodded once like an inspector with a clipboard. Then I reached under the table and placed the binder on the wood, the ledger of years and transfers and quiet rescues. Tuition, down payments, months of mortgage, the invisible lifts a father gives and never itemizes out loud. I didn't wave the numbers like weapons. I laid them out like joists and showed him where they'd been nailed. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling the way a person does when they want the universe to supply a better explanation. The lamplight put a little shine on his cheekbones. He looked younger for a second and then he didn't. He reached for indignation and found it slippery. He pivoted to pity instead. Tried to shape his face into concern for my mental health. I let the words travel past me like wind. When he suggested I might be confused by online misinformation, I slid a second sheet forward, the chain of custody notation and the technician's signature. No algorithm had done this. People had. Their names were on the page. Outside, a car door clicked somewhere in the wet. My neighbor's wind chimes answered with a dull metallic note. He flinched at the sound and then pretended he hadn't. The house felt smaller, then larger, then exactly the size it always was. I opened the folder's final tab and removed the clean stack Amira had prepared, the documents that turned air into structure. Disinheritance affidavit, notice of revocation, updated designations, the trust's first page with Ethan's name in bold, the ink quiet and permanent. I told him there were 2 doors in this room. One opened to sirens and a detective who had already seen too many fathers poisoned by kindness. The other opened to a signature that acknowledged my right to protect myself and my grandson without the courtroom's appetite. I said there would be conditions either way. Treatment, distance. No access to me or my accounts. No proximity to the house when I wasn't here. No access to Ethan's trust, not now, not ever. I said it the way you say, no climbing on the scaffold. Not angry, not cruel, just the rule if you want the building to stand. He didn't pick up the pen. He didn't pick up the phone. He picked up the past. He talked about coaching t-ball one summer. He mentioned Christmas lights we'd hung together and trips I'd paid for, and a single fever he'd nursed at 3 in the morning when he was 13 and I was sick. He wanted to balance the ledger with sentiment. I let him talk long enough to hear himself fail. Memory is a beautiful liar until you ask it for receipts. I tapped the binder's spine with one finger and then rested my hand on the trust. He followed the gesture and understood that stories had met paper and paper was winning. My phone vibrated face down on the table. I flipped it and read the banner. Jenna. A single line. I'm in the car outside. If he spirals, I'll drive. And another, arriving before I could type a reply. I sent you 3 files. I opened the attachment and heard Melvin's voice in my living room from the small speaker, flat and clinical, practicing a condolence speech into a phone in what sounded like a bathroom. He stumbled over the phrase passed peacefully twice, then nailed it on the 3rd attempt. He addressed an imaginary crowd, thanked them for their support, referenced my kind heart, misremembered my career by a decade, and tried the word legacy 3 different ways. The recording ended in the scrape of a cabinet door and a curse too soft for the microphone. I didn't play it loud. I didn't need to. I watched his face while I listened. A good liar can keep his features still for many things. It is hard to keep them still when they are forced to overhear their rehearsal for your funeral. The color drained and then surged back. He reached for anger the way drowning men reach for rope. He found only air. He told me I was humiliating him. He told me this was entrapment. He told me I had no idea what kind of pressure he was under. He said the word debt like a sacrament and the word father like a complaint. I reminded him I had pulled his HELIC filings and the small claims judgment and the HOA notices. I reminded him he'd had a father with a truck and a toolbox and a wallet and a willingness to show up every time the world moved 1 inch against him. I told him that if pressure made him pour poison into a bottle, then he needed a place with locks and professionals, not a house with a man he hoped would go quietly. His mouth opened and closed. The glass was still in his hand. He didn't seem to know what to do with it now that it was clean. I pushed the pen across the table. The pen stopped at the line Amira had marked with a flat blue flag. My index card in my wallet warmed against my hip like a small coal. Protect the boy. Let paper speak. No rage. Breathe. I did each thing in order, the way you torque bolts, steady with the right sequence. He stared at the signature line like it was a cliff edge. He asked if Ethan knew about any of this. I said Ethan knew exactly enough and that I would not ask a child to carry more weight than he already had. The rain thickened on the windows, each drop a small hammer. He asked what would happen if he refused. I said the detective's card was on the table for a reason and that the recordings and the lab report and my cameras were the sort of things prosecutors like when they get tired of bad sons calling bad things misunderstandings. His shoulders dropped. A visible collapse I recognized from the years before when jobs fell through and arrogance had not yet hardened into entitlement. He picked up the pen. His hand shook. For a second, I wanted to steady it. A strange reflex. A father thing you have to cut out of yourself like a splinter when your child becomes a danger instead of a person you can rescue. He signed. He initialed. He slid the pages back in a stack with the corners slightly misaligned. I straightened them by touch. He reached for the glass then, not to drink but the way a person reaches for a prop when they want a different scene. His wrist clipped the rim. The whiskey tipped and spilled. A thin amber river moving across the wood and touching the corner of the ledger before I could lift it. He flinched like it burned. Maybe it did. He whispered an apology that didn't land anywhere that could use it. I handed him a dish towel and let him blot the shine. He couldn't meet my eyes. He looked past me to the mantel where Martha's picture sits, her smile holding the same quiet instruction it's held since I put it there. Finish the job. He asked if this meant I was throwing him away. The question hung in the air like damp laundry that refuses to dry. I told him I was not a trash can. I told him I was a boundary. I told him that if he wanted to be a son again someday, He could do it with a counselor and a sponsor and the kind of bravery it takes to call things by their names. He nodded without understanding and stood too fast, the towel dropping to the floor. The door was 2 rooms away, but it felt farther. He hesitated at the threshold like a man who doesn't know which way traffic is coming. Car idled on the street. Headlights bounced across the wet like fish. Jenna's shape was a shadow behind glass. He didn't look back at me, which was mercy. He stepped out into the soft Seattle rain and closed the door without slamming it. The quiet afterward was different from the quiet before. Emptier, but breathable. I locked the deadbolt, not because I thought he'd return, but because rituals matter. In the kitchen, I wrung the towel under hot water until the whiskey smell left it. I put it on the radiator, an old habit from winters in a smaller house. I returned to the living room, lifted the binder, and slid the signed pages into their sleeves. The click of plastic felt like a final nail set flush. My phone buzzed. Jenna again. She didn't send words this time. Just a check mark and then one more message. I'm taking him to the ER. He's not well. Thank you for keeping Ethan safe. The window fogged where my breath met the glass as I looked out. Her Subaru eased away from the curb, taillights making 2 small red commas in the rain before turning the corner. I sat on the couch and finally let the tremor come up through my knees the way it had wanted to all evening. I put both hands flat on my thighs and listened for the ferry horn across the water. It came soft and late, stitched through the rain like a thread pulling something closed. On the coffee table, the clean whiskey waited in the decanter, golden and untroubled. I poured the inch I hadn't allowed myself earlier and held it a long time without lifting it to my mouth. I thought about the boy who had texted me in secret, and the woman waiting in a car with her hazards on, and the daughter who had asked me if I needed her Monday, and the wife whose paper order had carried me across the last 2 days like a raft. I thought about how sometimes winning isn't a feeling you get. It's the absence of the worst thing happening. I raised the glass and let it touch my lip, but not for long. The taste was clean and bittersweet. I set it down and slid the detective's card back into the safe along with the signed pages. The cameras blinked in their corners. I picked up a pen and wrote the date on the inside cover of the binder in small block letters, then underlined it. Not to commemorate a victory, to mark the place where the world changed its weight and the house did not fall. The rain eased. The smell of citrus wax and wet wool and the faint ghost of Pete lived together in the room without arguing. I turned off the lamp and stood, listening to the old beams settle. The porch light still cut the night in a soft triangle. I imagined him sitting in a hospital hallway with Jenna, filling out forms that require you to admit what you've done with your days. I imagined Ethan asleep somewhere with his phone under his pillow, the way teenagers do when they are brave in the wrong decade. Before bed, I wrote one more line on the index card and tucked it behind the others. Do not mistake quiet for forgiveness. I slid the wallet back into my pocket as if I might need the reminder in the morning. Upstairs, the house kept its promise to creak only in the places I expect. I brushed my teeth. I folded my shirt. I turned back the covers Martha chose both for their softness and because they washed well. I lay down and listened for more rain. It came slower, then steadier again, like a person's breath when the worst of the storm has passed and the rest of it becomes weather. The house felt quieter than it had in years after the door shut behind Melvin. The silence wasn't peace, not yet, but it wasn't war either. It was the strange in-between, the echo left after a storm that has torn down branches but left the roots. I stood in the hallway, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the old beams in the ceiling, the steady drum of rain easing against the windows. For the first time in days, I wasn't listening for his footsteps or waiting for the sound of a car pulling up the driveway with intentions hidden in wrapping paper. He was gone, and the air was mine again. I walked back into the living room where the coffee table still bore the faint mark of spilled whiskey, a shallow amber stain that hadn't fully dried into the wood. The binder lay closed, heavier now with his reluctant signature tucked inside. The papers were still warm from his hand, as if his shame had seeped into the fibers. I traced the corner of the leather cover with one finger and thought about how many times I had held blueprints in my career, pages that decided whether something stood or collapsed. Tonight I had held a different kind of design, a blueprint of survival and justice, and I knew which one carried the heavier weight. The phone buzzed on the arm of the chair. It was Ethan. Just 3 words, each typed too fast, letters uneven. "Love you, Grandpa." I felt the words land inside me like a beam being set firmly on a foundation. Solid, true, strong enough to hold. My hands shook as I typed back, not from age but from the flood of something deeper. "Love you too, son. Always." The message sent, and I stared at the small glowing screen until it dimmed again. The words tucked safely into the device the way his warning had been tucked into it days earlier. The words that saved me. I lifted my glass, the one I hadn't drunk from, in front of Melvin, and let the whiskey touch my lips. It was clean, honest. The peat and smoke rose in the back of my throat, and I thought of Martha's gentle laugh whenever I allowed myself a drink after a long week. She used to tease me about savoring things too slowly, about setting a glass down and forgetting it until the ice had melted into nothing. Tonight I drank with intention. I drank to the boy who risked his father's wrath to save his grandfather. I drank to the daughter who showed up early, sensing danger before I could name it. And I drank to the wife whose absence was still the loudest sound in this house, whose photograph still watched over me from the mantel, her eyes carrying both forgiveness and challenge. The glass emptied slower than my thoughts, and when I set it down, I felt steadier. The night stretched on, and I found myself in the kitchen, rinsing dishes from the dinner that had started everything. The clink of china in the sink was sharp against the hush. Each plate carried the ghost of a meal that was meant to be celebration, but became something closer to theater, a stage where truth waited to ambush pretense. I dried each dish carefully, setting them back in their place in the cabinet as though putting order back into my house could put order back into my life. When I reached the bourbon glasses, the ones I had arranged so carefully on the bar cart, I held one up to the light. Its clarity rang out in a pure note when I tapped it. Clean, untainted. I placed it back with reverence, a symbol reclaimed. Later, upstairs in my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, Martha's quilt folded back neatly. The rain had eased outside, leaving the neighborhood hushed except for the occasional hiss of tires on wet asphalt. I stared at her photo on the nightstand and whispered into the dim. "I kept us safe. I don't know if she would agree with how I did it. I don't know if she would call it justice or betrayal of the blood we shared with Melvin. But I knew she would have told me to protect the innocent, and Ethan was innocent. That was enough." Sleep didn't come quickly. I lay awake replaying every look on Melvin's face, every word he had tried to twist into reason. His laughter when I laid down the evidence, his desperation when the last option closed. I wondered where he was now, sitting in Jenna's car, silent and broken, or raging against the wheel, inventing new stories where he was the victim. I wondered if tomorrow he would convince himself it had been a misunderstanding, if he would tell himself lies so many times that he'd believe them. But I also wondered if, somewhere in that storm of denial, he would remember the weight of the pen in his hand and realize what he had lost forever. The house, the inheritance, the trust of his father. I wasn't sure which would cut deeper, maybe the last. By morning, the house felt lighter. I made coffee, the smell filling the kitchen in the way Martha loved, and carried the mug to the back porch. The yard was still damp from the storm, grass glistening in early sunlight. I sat in her old wicker chair, the one she used to read in, and let the steam rise into my face. Across the fence, the Hendersons were already out tending their roses, normal people living normal lives. I envied them, but I also pitied them, because they would never understand how quickly normal can unravel. I had seen the edge. I had stepped back. They didn't even know it was there. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Ella. "Just checking on you, Dad." I typed back, "I'm okay. More than okay. We'll talk tonight." She didn't push. She never did. I thought about telling her everything, about opening the whole binder in her presence, showing her the signatures and the affidavits and the trust documents. But I decided against it. She already carried enough. She had seen through her brother's mask long before I had. She had sounded the alarm in her own way. She deserved a measure of peace, not another ledger of betrayal. Later that afternoon, I drove into town, the binder locked in the safe under the seat, and delivered copies of the documents to Morrison and Associates. Margaret gave me her calm lawyer's smile, the one that hides steel underneath. "This protects Ethan," she said, tapping the trust. "And it protects you." I nodded, but I knew it did more than that. It protected something intangible, something Martha would have called the soul of a family. It ensured that legacy wasn't poisoned, even if bloodlines had been. Driving back, I passed the park where I had once taught Melvin to throw a baseball. I slowed, watching a boy his age then, no more than 10, pitching to his father. The father's glove popped as the ball landed, and his laugh carried across the field. I pulled over for a moment, watching, remembering. For a breath, I let myself imagine it was us again, before money, before entitlement, before poison. Just a boy and his dad on a field, sunlight on their faces, the world still wide open. Then the vision dissolved, and I drove on, the weight of reality pressing in again. That night Ethan called. His voice was small, but steady. "Grandpa, are you okay?" I told him I was. He hesitated, then asked, Did he really?" I stopped him before he finished. "You don't need to carry that, son. You carried enough already when you warned me." That was more bravery than most men show in a lifetime. He was quiet, then whispered, "I was scared." My throat tightened. "Bravery doesn't mean you're not scared, Ethan. It means you act anyway. And you did. You saved me." There was a long pause, and then a soft, "I love you, Grandpa." I closed my eyes. "I love you too, more than you'll ever know." After the call, I sat alone in the darkened living room, the binder back on the shelf, the whiskey bottle sealed and tucked away where it could do no harm. I thought about legacy, not the kind measured in money or property, but the kind measured in memory, in courage, in the truth a grandson chose over silence. I raised my glass again, not to Melvin, not to what was lost, but to Ethan, to Ella, to Martha, to every choice that had led me to this night where the house was quiet and the danger was past. In the end, revenge had not been a loud act. It had not been fists or fury. It had been paper and signatures, quiet truth spoken in a steady voice, a refusal to let betrayal be the last word. It had been the choice to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than collapse. And as I sat there, the house breathing softly around me, I realized that was the kind of engineering Martha would have been proud of. Not bridges of steel, but bridges of resolve. Not structures of concrete, but structures of love, tested under pressure and found still standing. I finished my glass and set it down gently, the ring it left on the table faint but real, a small reminder that even the strongest would carry marks. I looked up at Martha's picture and whispered the same words I had the night we buried her. "We're going to be okay." And for the first time since that birthday began, I almost believed it.